Thank you, Rocky, for introducing me. Thank you, IANDS, for having me, and a special thank you to all the attendees. It is really great to be here. It's hard to talk about near-death experiences without touching on reincarnation, because as the studies and so many of you know, when you have a near-death experience, you come back believing that reincarnation is a reality. Yet we oftentimes have a difficulty having people believe us. In fact, as Woody Allen said, I didn't believe in reincarnation in my past life, and I still don't. Now, with reincarnation, have you ever had fears and phobias that don't seem to have any apparent cause? Are you drawn to certain periods and cultures? Do you have talents, passions that feel natural? What about an eerie feeling you've lived before? Strong feelings of deja vu, recurring dreams? These are all indicators that you may be reflecting on a prior lifetime. And reincarnation is the belief that a living being starts a new life in a physical body after each biological death. And reincarnation is a Latin term. Being a lawyer, you know, I've had Latin shoved down my throat, and also being Catholic. Sorry. Reincarnation derives from Latin, literally meaning entering the flesh again. And we tend to think of reincarnation simply as a Hindu and Buddhist concept, and it's part of the doctrine of samsara, which is the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. And samsara indicates that we are born, we live a life in the material world, we die, and then we are reborn. And this is an ongoing cycle. And also karma is a very big component of reincarnation. And I think that all religions can be summed up in two words: be nice. Because karma never loses an address. And reincarnation is not just for Hindus and Buddhists anymore. In fact, the Dalai Lama recently said it's not an exclusively Hindu or Buddhist concept, but is part of the history of human origin. In fact, reincarnation is at the base of all of the great religions. However, in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, dun dun dun, it's like when you die, you go to heaven or hell. Now, as a medium, I realize that there are levels to the other side. And as a Catholic, I was raised to understand that there are levels to the other side. That heaven is for Catholics, purgatory is for Protestants, and hell is for everybody else. And purgatory is kind of like a cosmic probation. You know, you're not good enough to get in heaven, you're not bad enough to go to hell, so they stick you there for about 400,000 years to sort of, you know, be tortured, but not really. However, Abraham Lincoln also had feelings on purgatory. And perhaps marriage embraces the three rings of existence: the engagement ring, the wedding ring, and the suffering. However, as I indicated, reincarnation is at the root of all of the great religions. And in ancient Judaism, in the Hasidic sect, there is a belief that we live a succession of lifetimes. And this is indicated in the book of Job, where it says, "Naked I left my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there." And when you start looking at the Kabbalah and the more mystical aspects of Judaism, you find that there is a school of thought which embraces a succession of lifetimes. Now, I found this fascinating photo of an ancient mosaic from Israel, and who recognizes this? Live long and prosper. Leonard Nimoy, who we all know as Mr. Spock, was a devout Jew, and it was his idea to incorporate live long and prosper and this symbol into Star Trek. So it kind of became the Vulcan tagline. So I guess the Vulcans are the Hebrews of the Alpha Quadrant. In ancient Jerusalem, though, the concept of hell developed because of the Valley of Gehenna. And outside of Jerusalem, there was this area where if you were a criminal, or if you died with no honor, or if you could not afford a proper entombment, a proper burial, then your body was taken and you were thrown into burning sulfur pits that they called brimstone. So if you were bad, your fate was fire and brimstone. So this sort of became indoctrinated in the ancient Jewish tradition. And then when Christianity began to take root in the area, it got incorporated. Now, the thing about the Roman Empire and General Pompey the Great, and we tend not to remember Pompey so much because Julius Caesar cooked his clock, but talk about a pompous Roman general. I guess that's maybe where the word pompous came from, I'm not sure. But anyway, Pompey conquered Judea, and it became a client state of the Roman Empire. And the thing about the Romans is their empire spread from Britain all the way to the border of Iran, which was called Persia at the time. But Judea became what was known as a client state. The reason I'm saying this is that the Romans were very good at assimilating other concepts in other cultures. I mean, their culture and religion initially was based on the Greek culture, which centered on the Aegean and in Sicily, and then with their conquests along the Germanic border, they started incorporating concepts from the Nordic religion. In fact, the god Loki, the evil god of the Nordic religion, he was the lord of the underworld. He was connected with fire and magic. He could assume many different shapes. He was crafty, malicious. And in Norse mythology, the god Balder, the young, beautiful, handsome god, was struck down by the evil Loki, and on the third day rose from the dead with the help of his mother, the goddess Freya. I'm sure that had no influence on other religions going on in the Roman Empire. So in the early Christian era, there were many thinkers, particularly Origen of Alexandria. Now, Origen is a fascinating philosopher, and he was based in the city of Alexandria, which is now in Egypt. He rejected the notion of eternal damnation and said that everyone, even Satan, will eventually ascend to heaven, and that we go through a succession of lifetimes. So one of the early schools of Christian thought is that reincarnation was a reality. Well, as time went on, in the 300s, the Roman Empire was engulfed in civil wars. And rival generals were battling for power, and the general Constantine was facing off his rival Maxentius. And this was two huge Roman armies. And the battle was at the Milvian Bridge. And the night before, according to legend, Constantine, who was a pagan at the time, had a vision of a cross glowing in the sky with a message, "In this sign you shall conquer." So Constantine realized that this was a Christian symbol and ordered all of the soldiers in the Roman legions to paint the letter C on their shields. Now, of course, Christians think that that was Christos honoring Jesus, or was it Constantine honoring Constantine? But in any event, he destroyed the other army and became the absolute emperor of Rome. And so now Constantine had become the most powerful man in the Roman world, and he also decided that there was too much fragmentation in the empire. Christianity was widespread. One of the first things he did is stop the persecution against it, and he said there needs to be an authoritative text for this new religion. So he ordered all the bishops assembled in the city of Nicaea, which is now in Turkey, and said, create an authoritative text. So they ransacked the entire Mediterranean world, and the first version of the Bible was released at the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. Now, the imperial decree said that Jesus is God and will return, but until he does, I, Constantine, Emperor of the Romans, am God's representative and vice-regent on earth. Okay, so this is where the divine right of kings comes from. And there's another important facet about this. There was one empire one emperor, one church, one God. And the word of the emperor was the word of God. And if you disobeyed the empire, you went to hell and suffered eternal damnation in fire and brimstone. And this is what changed the entire philosophy of Christianity from being one of peace and love and understanding into a fear-based religion with eternal damnation as your punishment. And Constantine did more than just start Christianity as the religion of the empire. He moved the capital from Rome to the city of Constantinople, named after himself. Now let's talk for a second about Saint Constantine, because in the Catholic Church, he's a real big deal. The first Christian emperor of Rome, Saint Constantine. Yeah, he was a really great guy. He pretty much had everyone in his family executed because he was paranoid. He was genocidal. He was tyrannical. He was probably a psychopath. He was incredibly paranoid. And his mother is Saint Helena. And he sent his mother on a holy pilgrimage from Constantinople to Jerusalem. And Saint Helena found the one true cross. Well, let's see what probably really happened. All right, the emperor's mother is going to Constantinople. I doubt that she was walking there as a peasant, so she probably had at least 100 attendants doing her hair, fixing her face, doing her clothes. Then there would be the Roman legion protecting her, so there's another 5,000 people. Then she arrives in Judea, and the Roman general in charge of the province probably had another 2 legions, so there's about 15 to 20,000 people as she goes to Golgotha, the site of Jesus' crucifixion. And I can only imagine one of the officials, probably a bishop, going, "Your Majesty, perhaps you should dig here." And so she goes over and digs, and voila, there's the one true cross, okay? So she brings it back to Constantinople, and it's a relic. Now, the thing about the Christian world is they like relics. And there's probably been enough fragments of the original cross to build Noah's Ark. So Saint Helena, the emperor, his mother is declared a saint while she's alive. So Constantine really concentrated imperial authority upon the emperor. But by splitting the empire into 2 sections, the eastern half was more prosperous and survived the collapse of the Western Empire the next century. And the important thing about that is that divine right of kings. Oh boy, did every king and duke and ruler in Western Europe and North Africa grab that. And then when Islam started swallowing up the whole Middle East and being influenced by Christianity, you think the Islamic leaders didn't love that whole divine right of kings? And that's where the concept of the caliph comes from, a political leader ordained by God. And that's why when ISIS was forming, it was so disturbing, because they were referring to themselves as the caliphate, the caliph, a political organization ordained by God. But I digress. So, 200 years after Constantine's death, the Eastern Empire, focused on Constantinople, the Emperor Justinian held the 5th Ecumenical Council. Reincarnation was banned as heresy and abolished from Christianity entirely. Or did it? It is believed by many scholars that references to reincarnation have survived in the Bible, particularly Matthew, chapter 17, verses 12 through 13. This is right after the Transformation. Now, mediums, we love the Transformation. Transfiguration. Jesus takes a group of apostles up to the top of a mountain. He begins to glow white, and the images of Moses and Elijah appear on either side of him. Talk about a near-death experience. Also, this could very well be an example of what is known as physical mediumship. Physical mediums are able to project a glowing white substance known as ectoplasm, which forms the images of the people communicating. Now, Jesus, being Jesus, is certainly probably the most developed spiritual leader of all time. So when they come off the mountain, the apostles are like, well, he says, who do you say that I am? And the reply was, well, some say that you're John the Baptist, others say that you're Elijah. And Jesus' reply was, Elijah does come, and he is to restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come, And they did not know him, but did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man will suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. Basically, what Jesus said was, Elijah did return in the form of John the Baptist. Interesting. John the Baptist was Jesus' cousin, and Elijah lived roughly 800 years earlier. That sounds a lot like reincarnation to me. So Jesus said that, yeah, Elijah reincarnated, except he was John the Baptist. So, and this is also found in both the chapters of Mark and of Luke. Now, people get nervous when we talk about Islam, but Islam, in some of the more philosophical branches of it, also addresses the concept of ma'an, the returning. And it's been debated by Islamic theologians for over 1,000 years. And one of their great philosophers, Rumi, wrote, I died as a mineral and became a plant. I died as a plant and rose to animal. I died as an animal and I was man. Why should I fear? When was I less by dying? And Rumi was a proponent, Islamic proponent of reincarnation. Benjamin Franklin is reputed to have believed in reincarnation. He wrote his own epitaph. The printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms. But the work shall not be wholly lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more perfect edition, corrected and amended by the author. Thomas Edison, George S. Patton, Henry Ford all believed in reincarnation. In fact, when Patton was cooking Rommel's clock in North Africa and getting ready to invade Sicily, Rommel brought his chief of staff together and he says, I want to know about Patton. They said, well, he's the commander of the Third Army. He goes, I want to know about the man. They said, well, he's the richest officer in the American Army and he believes in reincarnation. And he landed exactly where the Athenians did almost 2,000 years before, and Rommel was ready for him, and fortunately, Patton was a better general. Then Henry Ford said, I adopted the theory of reincarnation when I was 26 because genius is experience, and some think to seem it is a gift or talent, but it is the fruit of long experience in many lives. Now, these are some pretty no-nonsense guys. And they caught a lot of flack for believing in reincarnation. Reincarnation became exposed in a big way to the West when George Harrison, through his friendship with Ravi Shankar, started writing about it in his songs, both in the Beatles and in his solo career, and talking about it openly. And then Shirley MacLaine went out on a limb. A major movie star started talking about reincarnation and past lives. One of the great honors of my life was being interviewed by Shirley MacLaine last year on her radio show, Independent Expressions. And if you want to find out more about that, come to dinner tonight. Now, Oprah Winfrey, Loretta Lynn, Prince. All right, we're talking people all over the political, musical, cultural spectrum are now embracing reincarnation. And of course, George Lucas, who also, by the way, happened to have a near-death experience. One can only wonder where he got some of his ideas, like the Force. The Force being an energy that connects all of us and binds us, and that there's positive and negative energy in the universe. Albert Einstein, one of my all-time heroes. I probably shouldn't say this live streaming in front of all you people, but when we were at Princeton, we weren't supposed to do this, but I snuck into Einstein's classroom. I just had to be there. It was just to feel where this incredible mind had taught. And Einstein said that science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. And recently, the Center for Reincarnation Studies, welcome back. Reincarnation, Dr. Ian Stevenson was probably the first scientist, doctor, to apply the scientific method to reincarnation. And he was a psychiatrist at UVA, University of Virginia, studied over 3,000 cases of children who remembered prior lives. He approached reincarnation from a strictly scientific viewpoint, and he saw his job as to gather anomalous data. And that's what I really like about Dr. Stevenson is he gathered the data, he presented the evidence, and let the reader, the audience, the thinker decide for themselves. He avoided religious discussion. And we all know with NDEs, and I appreciate because IANDS is saying, we got to avoid religion. Come on. Isn't it kind of hard to talk about death and God and the afterlife without some reference to religion? And I know that I poke fun occasionally at some religions. I'm a big proponent of people of faith and religion as long as it's used for peace and love and understanding, because that is the path to God. And the ultimate act of ego is creating God in your own image, so then he gets to hate the same people you do. So what Dr. Stevenson found is, as soon as the child could communicate, he or she begins to describe a previous lifetime. The child starts to remember details of his or her death. Based on information provided by the child to their biological family, they can find a family from a prior incarnation. Now, this only works with people that reincarnated, a couple decades or so afterwards. Personality traits, personal preferences, habits often persist. Gender usually stays the same. Relationships are renewed through reincarnation. And traumatic deaths in particular leave an emotional imprint. Often the child had habits and fears linked to the nature of the death. In other words, if you're terrified of water, if you're terrified of heights, if you have certain phobias and fears that appear to have no basis in your existence in this life, Dr. Stevenson theorized that this could be carried over from a prior incarnation. And this brings us to the case of James Leininger. As a toddler, he began to have nightmares about being trapped in a plane shot down by the Japanese. Now, we're talking, 2, 3-year-old, and he kept talking about my plane was a Corsair. He said I was on the Natoma. He kept talking about Chichi-jima, and he also started drawing pictures of this, and he kept calling himself James the Third, James 3, James 3. He said, I have a friend, Jack Larson, and then he had 3 G.I. Joe dolls, Leon, Walter, and Billy. His parents they were perplexed. So his dad started doing some research, and a lot of people said, well, the Natoma Bay the USS Natoma Bay was an aircraft carrier, and it didn't start carrying Corsairs until right before the Battle of Iwo Jima. They also found that there was a Lieutenant James Houston, Jr., a 21-year-old pilot who served aboard the Natoma Bay, who was shot down at Chichi-jima in the Battle of Iwo Jima, and he had 3 friends, Leon, Walter, and Billy, who were his fellow pilots. But why James 3? His father was Bruce Leininger. Well, James Hudson was a junior. James Hudson's father was a James. So in this little boy's mind, he was the continuity of that line. He was the 3rd James in that family. And what about his friend and fellow Corsair pilot, Jack Larson? They searched everywhere through veterans records, couldn't find any record of Jack Larson. Until, of course, they went to a Natoma Bay reunion and Jack Larson was still alive. And this little boy started talking to them, and Jack Larson said he knew details about things we did, girls we dated. This kid gave some pretty spectacular details, and he was convinced that James Houston had been reborn. And then he met Ann Houston Barron, who was 84 years old, and said, this child couldn't know the things he does. He just couldn't. I somehow think he is part of my brother. Now, when we think about reincarnation, we all like to picture ourselves as a king or a queen. Chances are we're going to be the ones in the mud. I mean, y'all think, oh, I'd like to live at Downton Abbey. Yeah, well, chances are you're the one cleaning the latrine at Downton Abbey. But this brings me to one of the cases that I document in my book, Evidence of Eternity, about Louise Eddy, who came to be known as Om Seti. Now, she was born into a proper Edwardian family in England, and when she was a small child, she fell and had a head injury, and then came out of it and started talking about, I want to go home, and started describing ancient Egypt and Pharaoh Seti, and giving this incredible detail of these Egyptian temples and the religion. Well, her family, being proper Edwardians, considered her insane and shipped her off to the loony bin. But after years of therapy, she never relented that she was from ancient Egypt. And so when she was 18 years old, she left England, sailed to Egypt, initially started working with archaeologists on the Giza Plateau, where the pyramids are, but she felt drawn to go farther south to the temple of Pharaoh Seti I in Abydos. Now, here's what's fascinating about her. She learned not only how to read Egyptian hieroglyphs, but to speak it in under a year. It takes PhDs years just to decipher hieroglyphs. And from friends of mine who are archaeologists, they say, if you think verb conjugation is difficult in English, try the Egyptian verb, okay, when you have a falcon and a doot and a dash and this, and start conjugating into past, present, and future. And Om Seti could do this. And when she would walk into temples, she would take her shoes off and she would go and she would pray. So the archaeologists were humoring her a bit, and then she said, you know, there used to be an orchard over there, an irrigation system over here, and she started explaining, like, yeah. Well, then, as they were excavating the site, they found remains of an orchard, exactly where she said it was, the remains of an irrigation system, exactly where she said it was. Folks, this is in the early 1900s. It's not like she Googled this, and this is when they were actually excavating this for the very first time. She was interviewed several times. She died in the 1980s, and I remember one of the funniest quotes. She said, "Many people come to Egypt in search of a prior life. You have no idea how many Cleopatras I've met." Albert Einstein said, matter is energy. Energy is light. We are all light beings. And life as we know it depends on light. If it were not for the energy of the sun, the light of the sun, this world would be nothing more than a chunk of ice floating through space. All the food we eat depends upon photosynthesis. All the plants that we eat, the animals that we eat that eat plants. When I was on this one show in Canada, Rob McConnell's show, The X Zone, he said, well, what about mushrooms? I said, mushrooms grow because they feed upon decaying matter that depended on light to grow. He goes, oh, well, you got me there. Every great spiritual teacher has described God as light. Going back 5,000 years ago to Krishna in India, speaking of God as light. When Moses had his spiritual transformative experience and he saw a burning bush, that's light. Buddha said, I will show you the way to the light. Jesus said, I am the light. Gandhi, Mother Teresa, even Billy Graham, the Taoists, you get the Native Americans, all the belief systems describe God in terms of light. And I can tell all the NDEers are shaking their head because when you go into the light, that is how we're perceiving the spiritual energy of God. Now, quantum physics, one of my favorite subjects, we all know that everything is created of molecules. We all had to learn this, right? You all did go to school, right? Come on, the dead folks are on the other side. Let's bring the energy up. All right, so everything's made of molecules. We know the molecules are made of atoms. We know atoms are made of electrons, neutrons, and protons. And now we know that on a subatomic level, everything is made of an electromagnetic particle known as quanta, ergo quantum physics, particle physics. Everything. This stage, me, you, the table, the air we're breathing, the light shining on me, the space between the earth and the sun itself, the galaxy, the space between our galaxy and others is all made of quanta, the same energy, electromagnetic energy. Now, if you drop something on your foot, it hurts right away. Okay, you know this. And scientists have been wondering, how does that information get to your head at the speed of light? Well, we know it's not chemical. Yes, we have an electrical system in our body, we know that. But the Russians discovered in the 1920s, and it's been rediscovered, or rather reaffirmed recently, biophotons. Our cells, our individual cells, emit light. In fact, one cell can emit up to 100,000 flashes of light within a minute. And Sergei Mibrov at Lebedev Institute in Moscow said that biophoton streams consist of short quasi-periodic bursts similar to those used to send binary data. Now, this is different than bioluminescence, like a firefly or a lightning bug or something like that. That's a chemical reaction that creates light. This is actually ultra-weak light emissions on a cellular level. So what this means is that our body communicates using light, and we know through quantum physics that light can transmit energy and information. So our body is a matrix of light that uses light to communicate. That's how our cells talk to each other. And I love German physicists. Can you think of anyone more serious than a German physicist? Professor Fritz Albert Popp of the International Institute of Biophysics in Germany said, biophoton emission is a general phenomenon of all living systems. Biophotons originate from a coherent photon field within the living organism, its function being intra- and intercellular regulation and communication. In other words, our cells talk to each other using light. One of the concepts that I present in Evidence of Eternity, and one I'm also further developing in my new book I'm working on, is enlightenment. Now, we all know from meditation and from religious and near-death experiences, spiritual experiences, enlightenment is a knowing, connecting with the light. Enlightenment is acknowledgement of the light within. And now we have proof that the light within exists. It's biophotons. So the light that all life depends on, the light that is the energy of God, resides within us in our own cells. The light is pure. The light is beautiful and filled with love and cannot be polluted. However, it can be blocked. And that's where our personal decisions come in. Energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred from one form to another. The quantum electromagnetic field that exists within our brain is energy. So the question is, what came first, the consciousness or the brain? What? Of course the consciousness. This is IANDS, okay? It's really nice talking to people who get it, you know? I talk to some place, they're like, so if my parents get divorced, is they still brother and sister? But here, what, you think as NDEers you're the only ones that get dumb questions? I'm a medium and a lawyer, come on. All right, so faith teaches us that the soul, aka consciousness, is an immortal living spirit. So in the realm of faith, we refer to this as a soul or a spirit. In the realm of science, we refer to who we are as consciousness. But I take this even further and call this quantum consciousness. Now, Dr. Robert Lanza put forth the theory of biocentrism. The death of consciousness only exists as a thought, because people identify themselves with a body. And it's kind of easy to do that. Think of your body as a car, okay? And some cars are hot and shiny and fast, okay? And everyone goes, ooh, I like that car. And then others, you know, not so much. And the thing is, but you're not the car. When the car ceases to function, you get out of the car and you move on. You are not your body. And what Dr. Lanza said is that if a body receives consciousness the same way a cable box receives satellite signals, then of course consciousness doesn't end at death. And the energy of your consciousness gets recycled back into a different body at some point, and in the meantime exists outside of the physical body on some other level of reality and possibly in another universe. My friends, here's your scientific explanation not only for reincarnation but for near-death experiences. This is it. Approximately 37,600 Americans develop Alzheimer's. Death often involves a long, protracted process. Patient becomes non-responsive, non-communicative. They don't even recognize loved ones. I'm dealing with this in my own family right now, and it's painful. You know, my dad was a NASA engineer. He was a Navy SEAL, and he can't even remember what he had for breakfast 10 seconds after he ate it. And it's heartbreaking. But what we're seeing is with Alzheimer's is that it is an organic change in the brain. There's a brain afflicted with Alzheimer's, there's a healthy brain. And so the actual organ is damaged. It's not functioning properly. It's shrunken, the neurosynapses aren't firing, the blood vessels are no longer carrying the nutrients to the brain. Brain scientists agree. A severely damaged brain makes normal cognition impossible. Now see, this is where a lawyer, I love it with the skeptics. Oh, well, the brain is the consciousness, okay? It's like, this is where we got them, okay? So then, how come in 5 to 10% of cases involving terminally ill patients suffering from Alzheimer's and dementia, where death is imminent, suddenly the patient wakes up, gains complete lucidity, begins to identify people, talk to people. I just lived through this with my aunt. She was in hospice on the morphine drip, non-responsive, and at the last minute woke up and pointed to her son. This is known as terminal lucidity, an unexpected return of mental clarity which occurs preceding a patient's death. This phenomenon has been noted in patients with brain tumors, strokes, meningitis, schizophrenia, and Alzheimer's. The patient recovers their sanity in the last days or even hours of life. There's no observable change in the brain. The cerebral cortex, according to our skeptical friends, the neuroscientists, your brain doesn't suddenly grow 1 billion new neurons right before it dies, okay? There's no, according to them and according to the technology of the day, scientific explanation why this happens. So what accounts for it? And I have to add a story. Rocky, she had this cat that she loved and was with her for years, and the cat was dying, and she was holding her little kitty, which was essentially comatose. And she could feel the cat's heart beating erratically, and then all of a sudden he opened his eyes, looked up, took his paw, touched her face, and then died. So I think that terminal lucidity does not just happen with human beings. And in my mediumship presentation later, animals do communicate. Animals have souls. It is only human arrogance that assumes that we're the only one with souls. Wouldn't it be pathetic if we're the supreme pinnacle of intelligence in the universe? And people are always like, well, why don't aliens come and talk to us? Why would they? They're observing us, an incredibly violent species. They're destroying their own planet. If we give them technology, they're going to immediately turn it into a weapon and use it on us. So what accounts for terminal lucidity? Sir Roger Penrose from Oxford, one of my favorite places on the planet, and who's joined by Stuart Hammeroff of the University of Arizona, also MIT, the Institute of Material Sciences of Japan, and the University of Pennsylvania, have all said that consciousness derives from quantum vibrations within the brain's neurons. In the spiritual sense, consciousness has been here all along. Oh, my favorite, Hans-Peter Dohr at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. The brain is like a computer hard drive. When the hard drive dies, we do not lose the consciousness. The body dies, but the spiritual quantum field continues. In this way, we are immortal. Oh, come on, folks. All right. This is a rough crowd. Look at it this way. Your brain's a hard drive, okay? And when it crashes, you get uploaded to Microsoft Cloud or Dropbox, depending on which one you subscribe to. We don't die. And the brain is simply a formatting institute which houses the consciousness. It does not create the consciousness. So, as Buddha and science agree, you are not your body, which is very comforting to most people. And others not so much. I was just in LA. Everybody there is 2 pounds above organ failure. It's amazing anyone's feet actually touch the ground. They've been lifted so much. Namaste to all my friends in LA. All right, so I refer to our soul as quantum consciousness. And when the body dies, the energy of the quantum spiritual field is not destroyed. It is transferred. And where does it go? The Schwarzschild quantum lattice theory, this is one of my favorites. The study of atoms, particularly their subcomponent electrons, and this has been duplicated and conducted in laboratories around the world. What happens is one electron will disappear and then reappear in a completely different location without going through the matter in between. So where does it go? This is known as a quantum leap, and that's where energy transfers from one dimension to another. So if you're ever having an off day and you feel kind of spacey and you're not all there, well, it's because you're never all there. All right, your electrons are popping over this other dimension all the time. And the NDEers, guess what? That's what happened to you. You went to another frequency, another dimension. This, too, is scientific support for near-death experience. And this dimension, in my school of thought, is called the other side. Now, you can call the other side heaven, nirvana, samsara, happy valley, the Elysian fields, whatever you want to call it. I look at it this way. We live in AM radio. The other side is FM radio. Both frequencies have many different levels, many different amplitudes. And what happens is when we leave the material world and we die, our frequency then shifts to FM. Make sense? Thank you. The collective consciousness disconnect. This is another theory that I've put forth in my book, Evidence of Eternity, and also when I was talking to Dr. Gary Schwartz. He said his research indicates this as well. Think of when you die that your soul is a drop of water which separates from the body and then plunges into this infinite ocean. Now, there's a transition period, which is what happens with NDEs, because you're going from the finite hard drive, okay, finite perception, a finite consciousness, and you're making the transition then to an infinite level of awareness and consciousness. And so that's why when you're transitioning and the loved ones come forward because they get it and they know what's going on, they want to bring you into the light, which is then the quantum electromagnetic field, the force, as perhaps George Lucas would call it, that binds and connects all of us. So that's what's fascinating about NDEs, is because an NDE chronicles the transition from finite to infinite consciousness. Now, the good thing about an NDE is that you come back. The bad thing about an NDE is that you come back, okay? It's like NDEs, just dying to have one. You know, people go, oh, it's wonderful to have that experience. Well, you got to die to have it. I mean, that's kind of rough. I was 3 years old when I had mine, and from what I remember, not a whole lot of fun, especially for my mother. Near-death experiences. When a person physically dies, that person's spirit separates from the body and consciousness remains intact. Our hero, Dr. Raymond Moody, started near-death and coined the phrase near-death experience 40 years ago and began to apply the scientific method to observing, documenting, and understanding these experiences. And my friend and colleague, Dr. Jeffrey Long, who founded the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, and he is also taking it even further. In fact, where's Jody? Jody, there's his wife, Jody. She's awesome. And Dr. Long is working with developing a more advanced protocol for understanding near-death experiences. Many respected people in both ancient and modern times have had an NDE. Plato, I'm sure you've all heard of how he wrote in the Book of the Republic how the soul of left the cave of shadows to see the light of truth. Many people believe he was writing about himself. The Apostle Paul, I know a person in Christ who was caught up in the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. Mozart, Queen Victoria, Abraham Lincoln, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Elizabeth Taylor, Winston Churchill, all reported having near-death experiences. Elizabeth Taylor, in an interview she gave on ABC a couple years before her death, she described her NDE. And she said she went into the light and there was her first husband, the one true love of her life, Michael Todd. I figured it had been Richard Burton, but apparently not. And of course, my father had 2 NDEs, my mother had 2 NDEs, and I had one. The interesting thing, I've been through so many pictures. This is the only picture I have with both of my parents, and it was the day I graduated law school. Near-death experience similarities. When you come into contact with entities on the other side, they're people who are dead. You're convinced of its reality. Why? Because it is... Come on, say it like you mean it. All right. Race, gender, religion, not a factor. Drugs, anesthesia, not a factor. It's not a hallucination. Psychic ability enhanced. A lot of people say, if I have a near-death experience, will I be more psychic? Please do not test that theory. You lose your fear of death. And one of the most fascinating aspects, from an evidential standpoint, are intricate details. And my friend and colleague, Dr. Kenneth Ring, chronicled several cases. He's even done studies of people who were blind since birth, who had an NDE, and start giving visual, not just visual, but veridical, the 360-degree spherical visual accounts. And there was this one woman, she wasn't blind since birth, but she died on the operating table, and all of a sudden she felt herself hovering above the table and going a little bit higher, and then she passed a light fixture and said, you know, that's really dirty up there. I need to tell someone. And she goes, oh my gosh, I'm dead. And the next thing she realized, she was hovering above the hospital, and she saw in the rain gutters a red tennis shoe, a sneaker, stuck in the rain gutter. The next thing she knows, she comes back and she starts explaining this, and the surgeon, thankfully he was open-minded, said, get 2 people up on the roof right now. And they sent two hospital employees up to the roof, and exactly where she said, there was a red tennis shoe stuck in a rain gutter. Now, for all you skeptics and cynics who are watching this now, if an NDE is a function of a dying brain, how is it that something that wasn't in the brain is happening during that experience? That's one of those questions when you ask them on the witness stand, no further questions. The conclusion of near-death experience studies, consciousness survives physical death. And as Nancy Bush, who we were honored to have speak here yesterday, said that most near-death survivors say they don't think there is a God, they know there is a God. Edgar Casey, electricity or vibration is the same energy you call God. Not that God is an electric light or machine, But vibration that is creative is of the same energy as life itself, electromagnetic energy. Albert Einstein, concerning matter, we have been all wrong. What we have called matter is energy, whose vibration has been so lowered as to be perceptible to the senses. There is no matter. Everything is energy, and that's all there is to it. This is not philosophy. This is physics. Nikola Tesla, what one man calls God, another calls the laws of physics. And recently, Dr. Michio Kaku, the originator of string theory, says that there's not just a universe, but there are multiverses, several frequencies to the other side, and to existence itself. Eternal life does not violate the laws of physics. So, if energy, electromagnetic energy, quanta, contains and transmits intelligence, and energy is everywhere, does this mean God is everywhere? Absolutely. And if you want to know more about this, there's a book that was written by my favorite author of all time, me. For those of you who have published books, it's hard, isn't it? Don't you love it when editors that don't understand this stuff get hold of it? Okay, and they start, well, okay, so forgive me for using that joke, but I think I've earned the right. And if that book if you enjoy that book, the thing about evidence of eternity is what I'm doing here is I'm bridging the gap between the spiritual and the scientific. I'm explaining the afterlife and consciousness, and on the basis of science, quantum physics, spirituality, and evidence. Also with human physiology. There's physiological reasons for spirit communication, for what Dr. Long and Dr. Moody have termed ADC, after death communication. And then my first book, Never Letting Go, is a guide on the journey through grief. It has helped people all over the world, and I'll never forget when Never Letting Go came out. You know, when you put a book out and you wonder, has anyone read it? And I got this letter in the mail from Australia, and this lady said that she was so distraught after her mother died, and that she had been the caretaker for her mother for several years, and her mother got to the point where it was just untenable, so she took her to an assisted living facility, and the folks at the assisted living facility said, you have to leave now. And she said she'll never forget walking out of the room, hearing her mother screaming and crying, don't leave me, begging her not to leave. And her mother died that night. And she said that she was so overcome with guilt that she wanted to commit suicide. And for some reason, she was at a bookstore and found Never Letting Go, and that kept her from committing suicide. And I get worked up thinking about that. And if that's the only book I sold, then it was worth it. So, sorry. I want to thank you for having me here. How much time? We have a few minutes. We can either open for questions, or if everyone wants to take a break because we are delayed, I'm okay with that too. I'll leave it up to you. Okay. Oh, come on, a lawyer that talks to dead people, how often do you get that chance? If you could. Oh, seeing future events? That's a whole different discussion. But I will address it since you brought it up. In quantum physics, and in Stephen Hawking, I'm going to talk about him tonight. I don't want to give away the stuff I'm going to be talking about tonight at dinner. Einstein, Feynman, Hawking, the great quantum theorists, Max Planck, who came up with the the concept of quantum physics. Time has no time. We believe that time exists because we're born, we grow old, and we die. So we think of it in a linear fashion. You draw a line on the board and go from left to right. And it's normal and natural for us to think that. Plus, we live on a planet that rotates, and the sun comes up and goes down. But in the energetic sense, time doesn't exist. And the Buddhists actually got this, and the Hindus got this as well, is that there is no time, there's only right now. Because what I just said has now melted away, and now I've merged it into something else. So in the energetic sense, time, there is no past, present, and future. That's a matter of perception, much the way Einstein was explaining matter vibrates at different levels. And so in an NDE, it is not unusual to, of course, have the life review, which is reviewing your past and perhaps picking up on future events. During readings that I do, spirits will come forward and oftentimes will depict future events. I don't always understand what that means until it comes to pass. Friends and colleagues of mine who do purely psychic readings, where you tune into somebody's energy and you're able to discern what we would consider past, present, and future information, because what's going on from an energetic standpoint is different vibrations that we're tuning into. So that's the short explanation of how that happens. So it's like when Rocky and I were in Sedona last year, I was doing a mediumship demonstration, and Marjorie was there, and I kept talking about Orlando. Everything was Orlando, and it wasn't resonating with anyone, and then 3 hours later, the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando occurred. This happened with me in Paris, the Paris shootings with Nice. It happened with me in 9/11. I'm not going to give that away because that's how evidence of attorney starts. Same thing, my mom was like always picking up on things. And I make the joke that I'm of Italian descent, that Italians, Greeks, and Jews always assume the worst case possible scenario in every circumstance. So when you get something like that, you think, oh, well, this is something negative. Sometimes it is. And the reason that, all right, how many people here have kids and you have that feeling something's wrong with your child and they're not on the cell phone or that, but you know it? And that's because negative events have a deeper, heavier vibration, like the low E string on a guitar, that like that, and it's easier to pick up. Happy events have a higher vibration and you have to pay more attention to them. So that's why we tend to pick up on negative events more readily than positive ones. So, yes?
For you, what came first, the medium or the attorney?
Well, I was born, as Rocky indicated, I was fourth-generation psychic medium. I've tracked this on both sides of my family back into the 1800s. My dad and my mom both have mediumistic ability. My dad's sister, his mother, his maternal grandmother, my mother, and her maternal grandmother, who was actually featured in the PBS documentary, The Italian Americans. Her name was Giovanna, and there was a whole segment on my great-grandmother, Giovanna, and they referenced her psychic abilities. It was like watching it was like, oh my gosh, and then seeing pictures of my family posted there. So it appears to be a genetic recessive trait. Now, a recessive trait, let's say in my family, like brown eyes, brown hair, is a dominant trait. Blue eyes would be a recessive trait. So if you have two parents in a brown-eyed family and that have blue eyes, the likelihood of them having a blue-eyed child increases exponentially. And it appears to be the same with psychic abilities. And we know this is true with intelligence, with left-handedness, with certain diseases appear to be genetic. So there's a lot to this in the gene pool.
So were you guided to become an attorney then, from your mediumship?
If you read my books, it'll tell you that. Yes, sir.
What is the evidence that the green world has consciousness?
That the what world?
The green world, trees, plants.
They have energy, animals. Now, as in when I was in Arthur Findlay College in England, which is sort of Harry Potter for psychics. And that's a whole nother story. The thought there, the school of thought, is that any being capable of the emotion of love is capable of spirit communication. So do plants have souls? They certainly have biophotons. So we know that there's light and energy within them, and energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred. Now, in the animal world, I've communicated with dogs, cats, bunnies, a bear, horses, birds, a gerbil, but I've never communicated with a marigold. So I'm not saying that it's impossible, but in my realm of experience, that doesn't happen.
Okay, thank you.
See a gentleman, he let the lady go first. It is nice to see chivalry exists.
Hello. I'm not sure if this is a science question or more of a spiritual question, but you talked about terminal lucidity.
Yes.
When we become alert right before death. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be interesting, and could it be someday possible to expand that? For those of us that are worried about losing our mind someday or our memory, you know, it would seem if you can do it at the end, couldn't we somehow expand that?
Of course. Now, in the medical sense, there's a lot of things that we should be eating and doing that oftentimes we don't, that keep your vascular system clear. I understand coffee is good for sparking up the old neurosynapses. Woohoo! All right. Of course, some of my criminal clients, you know, use cocaine, which is a whole other story entirely, and usually I'm talking to them through plexiglass. But there are a number of things that you can do to keep your mind sharp and to expand your consciousness. Meditation, physical exercise. You've got to keep the blood flowing. In fact, at the VA, my dad's doctor is saying if you can get him more physical activity, it helps the blood flow in the brain, and just getting him to walk, you know, he's had a stroke and he's got cancer, so it's not like we're going to an aerobics class. But if I can get him to walk down the street, I notice after that he's sharper. So it's, once again, take care of the car.
Right. And yet it almost seems deeper than that, because if there's that spiritual component where we wake up at the end, clearly those people aren't doing those things, but suddenly they have.
I think what's happening there is that the quantum consciousness, the electromagnetic field in your brain, is getting ready to separate, so you get like an energy spike. And this, too, goes to show that the brain only houses consciousness, it doesn't create it.
Right.
Yes, sir.
I've heard you speak quite a bit of electromagnetic energy, but I haven't heard you say very much about subtle energies. Have you done any work or research into that side of things? To
me, all energy is electromagnetic energy. It's just varying frequencies and intensities of it. That's why I explained how particle mechanics, every single thing at its most basic unit is the same. And this is where I believe George Lucas got, and I'm not being funny here, talk about the force, the energy that connects and binds all of us. How many people in the spiritual and New Age field have heard we're all cells in the body of God? We're saying the same thing. Did not Jesus say, the light within? There are many mansions in my Father's house. When you start looking at different interpretations of that, this is indicating that, especially like in the New Testament with the Pentecost, like after Jesus has left this world, and his mother Mary and the disciples are sitting around and they see tongues of fire above their head. Well, what they're doing is they're having an enhanced spiritual experience, channeling the energy of the higher power. So in 1st century AD terminology, what would you call that? Looks like a flickering tongue of fire. And for those of us who see auras, a lot of times the crown chakra has a pyramidal type, flickery type look to it. Now we refer to it as a chakra, which is a term borrowed from India and incorporated into our understanding of this, and now we're calling it quantum electromagnetic energy. And an aura, anything that emanates energy has an aura. A light bulb has an aura. People have an aura. There's nothing mystical about it. It's merely a perception of energy. So when you look at what Buddha and Krishna and Jesus and Moses, the burning bush, what they were talking about was energy, but they were using the vernacular of the day. Now we have the terms that modern quantum physics has provided us to help us understand it on a more scientific level. Yes, sir.
Hello, thank you. I've had 2 NDEs.
A little bit closer to the mic, please.
And so I also read a recent book by Linda Evans Bush, Buddha in Hell.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what your perception is of that book and the evilness that may exist in a dimension we don't really understand. And could you talk to that, please?
I love what Nancy Bush said about the Buddha in Hell, how all the YouTubes, you hear people speaking in Burmese, and then it's being translated in English, presumably by evangelicals, okay, who like to put their spin on everything. And she also indicated that there are 90 references in the Bible to God being depicted as fire. So perhaps it's a misinterpretation, and that Buddha is actually in the fire, the light of God, but evangelicals, because, come on, there's one way to God. You must accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior. And I have no problem with anybody who does that. But I've been all over the world. I've dealt with Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, Taoists, Native Americans, and let me tell you, there are as many people as there are in the world is as many paths to God as there are in the world. It's about peace, love, understanding. So I seriously question that interpretation of what's happening there. It's like, let me real quick and then I'll get to you. Interpretation of prophecy in the ancient world, the city in Greece, of Delphi. I know we call it Delphi. My Greek friends have corrected me. It's Delphi. It was the oracle of Apollo. And for 1,000 years, that was the metaphysical epicenter of the Mediterranean world. Kings, emperors, Cleopatra was there, Mark Antony, Julius Caesar, Emperor Hadrian, they would all go to consult with the oracle of Apollo. Well, roughly about 250 to 300 BC, the Persian Empire was rapidly expanding in the Middle East. Imagine Iran causing trouble in the Middle East. Anyway, salam. So the wealthiest kingdom in the world was the kingdom of Lydia, which was essentially what we now call Turkey. And Croesus, King Croesus, was the richest king in the world, and so he was very concerned about the Persians, and so he went to the oracle of Apollo, and it was really cool. It's a beautiful place. You ever get a chance to go? And the priestesses of Apollo would sit on these tripods because Apollo was the god of prophecy above these geothermal vents, and you would go and present your question to the oracle, and you would receive an answer. And he said, "What should I do about the Persians?" And the response was, "If you attack the Persians, you will destroy a mighty empire." So he gathered up his army and all of his allies and attacked the Persians, and his army was annihilated. You got to be careful how you interpret prophecy. Yeah, he destroyed a mighty empire, his. So that's why when you see myself and other legitimate mediums doing readings, we say, "I'm getting this, does that make sense to you?" Because I see the snarky stuff people write on social media. "Oh, a real medium would know that." Well, a real medium doesn't jump to a conclusion. And that's what IANDS is all about. We're here to study and focus on evidence. We are scientists, we are philosophers, we are explorers. And we are receiving evidence and analyzing it instead of saying, "Well, everything that I saw fit with the King James Version of the Bible." I would hate to think that the entire universe is based on concepts developed in the Bronze Age. Anyway, to you.
Thanks, Mark, for being here.
Thank you.
I'm trying to develop my channeling and psychic abilities and was wondering if you had any advice.
Meditation. Trust yourself. Okay? A lot of times when, and with me, it's like something would come in, don't cross-examine it. Trust it. It's like with dream interpretation. If a message comes through, if a loved one in a dream comes through and it feels real and the message resonates with you, don't pick. Accept it. because these things are real. Spirits will communicate with you. We're surrounded by electromagnetic energy all the time. What are spirits? Electromagnetic energy. What are we? Electromagnetic energy, just vibrating at different frequencies. So when you open yourself up to frequency and get that negativity out of the way, then it will start to happen.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And a quick last question. When you connect to the other side, do you find that there's a certain level that you don't go above when we connect to frequencies and such?
In what way?
In that you can't go to angels or God, or though it is all God.
I've never found that. I have connected with angelic entities. With the NDE that I had as a child, I guess I should go ahead and tell it. I remember I was very, very sick, and I have a recollection of, and I know this is unusual, but I've been tested and studied and poked and prodded my whole life, and when I have a recollection going back to about 18 months old, and I remember things, a lot of traumatic things, because I was very sick and I wasn't supposed to live initially, and then when I was about 3 years old, I had impetigo, and I went into convulsions, and I stopped breathing. And my family, we were living in Orlando. We had moved from New Jersey because my dad got a job at Martin Marietta, which is now Lockheed Martin, and he was away on a business trip, and my mother didn't know what to do, and she scooped me up and ran outside and started screaming, "My baby is dying." And I know this because my mother told me this. My brother and sister, who are older than me, were there, and thank you, God, an off-duty fireman just happened to be taking a walk down the street, ran over and started pounding on my chest. And then the next thing I know, I'm in this light, and it's funny the way I describe them. They look like Academy Awards, okay, except translucent. It was like the outline of a human, but liquid, and this light glowed, and there was a whole bunch of them. They were really nice and really sweet, and they were like, "It's okay, you have to go back." And then the next thing I remember, I'm in an ambulance, and there's the tube down my throat, and somebody screamed, "We got a pulse!" And it was all this screaming and yelling, and my mom was in the ambulance, and then what happened was the hose to the oxygen got caught in the ambulance door, and they couldn't open it, and the paramedic was he goes, "We got to get the door open," and my mom goes, "I'll do it." They're going 90 miles an hour. He's holding on to her dress. She opens the door. He's coming, and they get the tube in, and I'm like coming in and out, but I'm back. And it was just amazing. And the thing is, though, because my parents were mediums, and my mom was an illustrator. She was a commercial illustrator. My dad was a NASA engineer. We weren't the woohoo, airy-fairy, bunny, granola, psychic family. And I would talk about that, like, "Oh, that's fine." So when I started seeing spirits, it was cool. Mom thought it was cool. Dad was like, "Oh, God," because he remembered what he had to put up with as a child and when he was in the Navy. So it was never a weird thing for me, and I've never questioned an afterlife. I went through a period in my life where I had my doubts, and then I found out that Mother Teresa went through that too, so I kind of felt better. And did not Jesus on the cross cry out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" So for those of you who have had a crisis of faith, for those of you who have doubted the reality of your near-death experience, who have struggled with your spirituality, without doubt, how can you have faith? So I'd like to thank everyone for attending. Many blessings. God bless you all. Thank you so very much. Thank you. Thank you.